Hey, how are you? Slice of Otaku, and just about everything in the world of My Hero Academia revolves around the existence of superhuman abilities known as quirks. And with this being the case, over the course of the series, we have been exposed to many different theories depicting its possible origins and purpose. But with so many conflicting accounts and stances, coming to what feels like a definitive answer seems to become increasingly difficult. Despite this, that's exactly what we'll attempt to do with this video, as well as figuring out why any of this matters in the long term. So, in the world of My Hero Academia, it's pretty common for quirks to be revered as human evolution, the furtherance of the species' biological advancement. Merriam-Webster denotes evolution to be the cumulative inherited change in a population of organisms through time, leading to the appearance of new forms. The process by which new species or populations of living things develop from pre-existing forms through successive generations. And now, this actually lines up pretty well with our current knowledge of quirks, as Deku's mother is described to be a 4th generation quirk wielder. And over the course of these generations, approximately 80% of the human populace have come to possess quirks. And as far as appearances go, heteromorphy has become rather common as well, only further construing the concept of what a human looks like. Historically, the process of long-lasting evolutionary change tends to take around 1 million years or longer. And although the story of My Hero Academia takes place on a fictional Earth, there doesn't seem to be any difference between their timeline and ours prior to the emergence of quirks. And scientifically, modern humans have only been around for about 200,000 years, which is obviously pretty short of the million we spoke of, but I wouldn't necessarily consider this to entirely debunk the theory. Humans are rather peculiar organisms being exposed to, as well as producing, various stimuli capable of inducing change to some degree. And so a more sound theory would be one consisting of rapid evolutionary change. Human activity has majorly distorted the planet and many of the organisms we share it with. So much so that several species have undergone rapid evolutionary changes as a means of survival on what is an observable basis. And so what's to stop such changes from manifesting in the case of the catalyst as well? There are 4 primary causes of evolution. These are mutation, genetic drift, natural selection, and gene flow. Genetic drift works particularly well in the case of small populations, so we can forget about that. And I'd say that quirks aren't streamlined enough in terms of applicability to be considered any sort of response to natural selection, so that can go too. Gene flow also isn't all that likely because, to my knowledge, being mixed isn't much of a superpower. And so what we're left with are mutations. In rare cases, children may come to possess quirks unlike any members of their family, and this is considered to be a mutation. We of course also have mutant quirk wielders and those with mutated appearances unrelated to their quirks passed on by their lineage. And although such distinct physiological differences vary from person to person, you may still recognize the presence of a quirk in a seemingly normal person by assessing the presence of an extra joint in their pinky toe. Which is pretty funny considering the pinky toe is often regarded as a useless appendage and one that humans will eventually lose to evolution.
I ain't playing no more. You put that f***ing razor away, I'm gonna blow your goddamn pinky toe off.
And although in reality that's not actually the case, from a writer's perspective, it may further point to a relationship between quirks and evolution. The first quirk wielder on record was the luminescent baby from China, which may have been a case of spontaneous genetic mutation. And genetic mutation may be further separated into either hereditary, that which is inherited from one's lineage, and somatic, that which is acquired during life. Most people have their quirks manifest around the age of 4 or 5, with them inheriting one of their parents' quirks or a fusion of the two. This is a hereditary genetic mutation. On the flip side, somatic genetic mutations in terms of quirks are absurdly rare to the point where they're generally not considered possible. But despite this, the 2 most important quirks in the story, One for All and All for One, both allow for the passage of such mutations. But regardless of all this evidence and our own deductions, one very simple fact thoroughly destroys this theory. Principal Nezu. Principal Nezu possesses the quirk known as High Spec, which provides him with intellect beyond that of your typical human. Principal Nezu is an example of an animal with a quirk. This is a case described to be incredibly rare, which by extension serves to corroborate the concept of other animals possessing quirks. With that being said, quirks are most definitely not human evolution. The psychopathic Chisaki Kai, better known by his villain name Overhaul, provided us with an ample amount of focus in regards to the concept of quirks actually being a disease. To further our conversation relating to Principal Nezu and the existence of animals that possess quirks, Overhaul very much subscribes to one particular theory, which attributes the initial spread of quirks to mice, whom are said to have spread a previously undiscovered virus across the world. And so, despite this theory possessing virtually no hard evidence behind it, there are those who consider quirks to be nothing more than a sickness, which I find to be rather peculiar, as historically, mice are commonly attributed with the spread of another virus that dramatically impacted human society, the bubonic plague, otherwise known as the Black Death. This epidemic resulting in what is estimated to be the death of approximately 50 million people in the 14th century. And so just the notion of any commonality between these two is cause for intrigue. Merriam-Webster defines the word disease to be a condition of the living animal or plant body or one of its parts that impairs normal functioning and is typically manifested by distinguishing signs and symptoms. And with that, very much like the earlier definition of evolution, things seem to line up pretty well. But to just leave it at that is like self-diagnosing yourself with WebMD the moment you begin to sneeze. When it comes to distinguishing signs and symptoms, we would need to be speaking very, very generally, as in quirk type categories, which consist of mutant, emitter, transformation, and accumulation. Otherwise, quirks are just way too diverse and ever-changing to ever be considered distinguishing. Another thing worth questioning would have to be the usage of the word normal. At this point, quirks have existed for well over 100 years, and with the mass majority of the population possessing them, can you even consider a lack of one to be normal? It's actually pretty common for relatively stable genetic conditions to become an integral part of a person's identity. So much so that you'll even have those who herald their quirk type above their nationality, and when recognizing someone else to possess a quirk similar to their own, may feel a sort of kinship towards them. And with that, defining disease is actually a lot more difficult than it may at first seem, as accurately defining health is just as hard. And that's probably because concepts of health are quite dependent on context. And with humans living such diversely different lives, it's very hard to apply any sort of one-size-fits-all approach to such things. But regardless, it is a very important conclusion to come to, as the associated societal implications are major. Back when quirks were a new phenomenon, with those who had them being the minority, society was thoroughly tested. You had those who used their abilities to get ahead in unjust ways, providing an influx in crime, and with it, disdain for such powers followed. And because of this lack of cultural acceptance, there were many who refused their own gifts, even turning to the likes of All for One in desperation. In fact, you could argue that it's the reluctance of society's provision of accommodations that actually provides weight to such issues. These days, because the majority of the population possesses quirks, discrimination has instead shifted towards those like Deku, who are born quirkless, which to me very much calls into question the construct of disability, as Deku, quirk or not, is a healthy human male, and just because you have a quirk doesn't necessarily mean it'll be advantageous to you. Not having a quirk is one thing, But at large, it would seem that quirks just introduce a myriad of new ways to discriminate. There are those who completely detest heteromorphs, those with quirks unjustly considered evil by nature, quirks deemed useless or even just too basic, and beyond morality, economically, the societal acceptance of quirks has given rise to several new markets as well as the expanse of pre-existing ones. The creation of clothes tailored towards heteromorphic convenience as well as support items are two such examples. Now, because of how quirks are genetically spread under typical circumstances, quirks seem to most align with the concept of single gene genetic inheritance. And as quirks proceed to permeate throughout human society, and further generations come to possess more powerful iterations and combinations of those which came before, we find ourselves with what is known as the quirk singularity theory. The concept that eventually quirks will become so complex that they are beyond human control, leading to inevitable devastation. But similarly to issues like global warming, it's just not taken as seriously as it probably should be. The structure of culture tends to heavily influence that which scientists choose to focus upon, and because quirks are so intertwined with human society at this point, you don't have an abundance of people with intentions of mitigating or outright eliminating them like Overhaul. Quirks and the benefits they provide are rather romanticized by the mainstream media. Heroes are admired greatly for the so-called heroic nature of their quirks, whereas villains are somewhat frequently victims to the nature of their quirks. Those with quirks that are particularly difficult to control, mentally and/or physically, tend to fall through the cracks. At this point in the story, considering all of the information currently at our disposal, I think it's reasonable for us to conclude that quirks are in fact a disease. However, with their current state of glorification, are not treated as such. This might sound really weird, but it kind of reminds me of how koalas, the ever popular adorable marsupials native to Australia, are almost all infected with chlamydia, or their version of it at least. I mean, have you ever actually heard a koala? Anyways, even beyond the Overhaul arc, it would seem as though Horikoshi has some major plans in regards to the true origin of quirks, and continues to present us with new ways in which it has shaped society both for the best and the absolute worst. Hopefully you all enjoyed the video and appreciate the amount of research put into it, as it's been on my mind for a while now. This past weekend, Jay and I had the pleasure of attending MomoCon 2019, and it was so much fun. Right now, I am just so inspired and motivated to create and try new things, so I suggest you stay on the lookout for all that's to come from this channel. And with that, as always, thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.